Have you ever watched a tech empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars burn to ashes because a guy in a Patagonia vest thought he was smarter than the woman who wrote the core code? If your office hides incompetence behind buzzwords and nepotism, grab a strong coffee. Today, I will explain how I let a rich kid self-destruct his career on a live broadcast, turning his stupidity into my early retirement check. Do not blink. Hello to all our wonderful listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep the lights on. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to cover their living expenses and continue bringing you the content you love. You can help by scanning the donation QR code right on your screen, or by clicking the link in the video description or pinned comment below. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. My name is Lexi Rivera. I am 32 years old, and until recently, I was the lead system architect at Vanguard Energy Tech, a rapidly rising startup based in Austin, Texas. We did not build superficial social media applications or food delivery platforms. We built the invisible, ironclad backbone of modern cities. Our flagship product, an artificial intelligence system named Aura Grid, was designed to coordinate smart electrical grids for entire municipalities. Aura Grid was my entire youth poured into hundreds of thousands of lines of meticulously crafted code. For 5 long years, I worked 80-hour weeks, fueled by lukewarm break-room coffee and sheer, stubborn willpower, to ensure the architecture was flawless. It had to be flawless. This was not some trivial mobile game where a server crash meant annoyed teenagers could not post a selfie. Aura Grid managed complex power distribution for regional hospitals, emergency dispatch centers, and critical municipal infrastructure. My system was engineered with one absolute, undeniable rule in mind. It could never, ever go down. I built it like a digital fortress, heavily layered with mathematical redundancies and deep fail-safes. It was my masterpiece. Then came a Tuesday morning that felt like a terrible punchline to a joke nobody in the engineering department wanted to hear. Our chief executive officer, Richard Sterling, called an emergency all-hands meeting. Richard was a classic venture capital darling, fantastic at shaking hands and raising funds, but he gladly left the actual, grueling engineering work to us. We stood around the glass-walled conference room, expecting a triumphant announcement about our upcoming Series C funding round. Instead, Richard dropped a massive bomb on my department. He proudly declared that his son, Julian Sterling, a 26-year-old who had just dropped out of his Master of Business Administration program halfway through, was joining the executive team as our brand new Chief Innovation Officer. Worse, Richard announced with a beaming smile that his boy Julian would be taking direct control over the Aura Grid project to, and I quote Richard exactly here, inject fresh disruptive energy into our legacy systems. Legacy systems? I had personally deployed the latest, state-of-the-art version just 3 weeks prior. My eye actually twitched. Julian's grand entrance was a masterclass in Silicon Valley cringe. He strolled into the boardroom 15 minutes late, holding an artisanal iced matcha latte like it was a scepter. He was wearing a ridiculously overpriced fleece vest, tailored athletic joggers, and limited edition sneakers with absolutely no socks. You could practically smell the cryptocurrency arrogance radiating off him. He looked less like an executive and more like a guy who was about to pitch me a useless blockchain startup at a networking mixer. He did not even bother to introduce himself to the lead developers. He just casually plugged his expensive tablet into the main display and pulled up my primary command dashboard. The dashboard was a brutalist, highly functional interface displaying real-time voltage loads, node latency, and failover status. It was dense, dark, and meant to be read instantly by highly trained engineers during a critical crisis. Julian squinted at the massive screen, took a loud, obnoxious sip of his matcha, and sighed heavily. Lexi, right? Listen, I am looking at this user interface right now, and I have to be completely honest with you. It is entirely lacking interactivity. It feels totally dead. There's absolutely no social media DNA here. Where is the gamification element? How do the grid managers feel engaged while they work? I stared at him, genuinely wondering if the lack of sleep had finally induced a hallucination. Julian, I said, trying to keep my voice low and steady, they do not need to feel engaged. They need to know immediately if the pediatric intensive care unit at Mercy Hospital is getting steady, uninterrupted voltage. This is a critical infrastructure management console, not a decentralized finance trading application. We do not need bright colors or pop-up animations. He chuckled, a wet, condescending sound that made my jaw clench tight enough to crack a tooth. That is exactly the kind of rigid, old-school thinking we need to disrupt around here. But do not worry. We will work on your outdated mindset later. For right now, I just need you to hand over your root admin privileges to me. The room went dead silent. You do not just ask a lead architect for root access like you are asking to borrow a stapler or a pen. Root access was the keys to the entire kingdom. Excuse me? I asked, my tone dropping to an icy whisper. Root access, Julian repeated slowly, as if he were trying to explain basic math to a toddler. I was at a networking retreat in Tahoe last weekend, and I bought a few third-party optimization plugins from a buddy of mine. They use advanced machine learning to dynamically reroute processing power. I am going to integrate them into AuraGrid's core today to really speed things up. My blood turned instantly cold. Absolutely not. You cannot just slap unvetted the third-party code into the root directory of a system that controls the national infrastructure. One tiny memory leak, one rogue algorithm overriding the safety protocols, and you could easily cause rolling blackouts across 3 entire counties. The answer is unequivocally no. Julian's condescending, smirking smile did not waver for a single second. He just looked down at me, gave a slow, deliberate nod, and unplugged his tablet from the monitor. Got it. So much for moving fast and breaking things. He turned around and walked out of the room without another word. For a brief, foolish moment, I thought I had won the battle. I thought professional logic and safety had prevailed over pure nepotism. I was incredibly naive. At exactly 4 p.m. that very same day, a bright red notification popped up on my screen. It was an official email from the Human Resources Department, sent with high priority. It was a formal written warning placed directly into my permanent employee file, officially citing a severe lack of team spirit and blatant insubordination towards senior leadership. That was the exact moment the illusion shattered. I realized Vanguard Energy Tech was no longer a serious technology company. It had become a billion-dollar playground for a spoiled child, and I was just the tired nanny standing in the way of his new, dangerous toys. It took exactly 10 days for our meticulously structured work environment to completely degenerate into an absolute circus. 10 days. That was all the time Julian needed to dismantle years of rigorous engineering protocols. The atmosphere in the office became thick with a suffocating, unspoken dread. Every morning, the development team walked in feeling like we were navigating a minefield, waiting for the next disastrous directive from our new Chief Innovation Officer. The first major casualty was our lead quality assurance engineer, a brilliant guy named Marcus. Marcus had an eagle eye for system vulnerabilities and a strict zero-tolerance policy for sloppy coding. When Julian forcefully pushed his newly purchased unvetted plugins into our testing environment, the system immediately began hemorrhaging. Marcus ran the diagnostic reports and formally flagged massive, cascading memory leaks that threatened to destabilize the entire grid management protocol within a matter of 48 hours. He took those urgent reports directly to Julian, fully expecting the launch to be halted. Instead, Julian fired him right there on the spot. The official termination notice claimed Marcus was hindering disruptive thinking and failing to align with our aggressive new growth trajectory. I watched security escort Marcus out of the building, carrying a small cardboard box of his belongings, knowing perfectly well that the only thing he was guilty of was trying to stop a catastrophic failure. You would reasonably think the chief executive officer would step in when his lead tester was fired over a legitimate safety warning. You would be completely wrong. Richard Sterling covered for his son without hesitation, as our diagnostic dashboards literally flashed bright red with critical warning signs. Richard decided the best course of action was to organize mandatory, company-wide team-building exercises, while our servers severely struggled to maintain basic operational integrity. We were forced into the main lobby to build towers out of dry spaghetti and marshmallows to foster cross-departmental synergy. It was surreal. I stood there, holding a marshmallow, listening to my phone vibrate constantly with automated distress alerts from our testing servers. Meanwhile, the Human Resources Department bombarded our inboxes daily with toxic positivity newsletters. They featured bright, colorful graphics and bold fonts, urging us to embrace the pivot and let youth lead us into the future of energy. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. The technical situation went from bad to horrifying later that week. I logged into the development server and noticed the core power load allocation algorithm was behaving erratically. The system was supposed to balance the electrical draw across different substations based on strict safety thresholds. Instead, it was wildly spiking and dropping loads without any logical pattern. I dug into the commit history and found that Julian had entirely replaced my proprietary allocation model. In its place, he had installed an open-source artificial intelligence model he found on a public developer forum. This model had never been stress-tested for municipal power grids. When I confronted him in the hallway, demanding to know why he would replace a stable algorithm with untested code, he did not even look up from his phone. He just casually mentioned that the new AI generated user interface charts that looked much cooler and had a more futuristic aesthetic for the upcoming presentation. He was literally risking the electrical stability of millions of people because he liked the color gradient on a pie chart. I felt a physical tightness in my chest, a suffocating realization that I was screaming into a void, in a state of pure desperation. I bypassed Julian and went straight to the top of the technical ladder. I marched into the office of our Chief Technology Officer, Wyatt. Wyatt was a seasoned engineer, a man who had built his career on caution and precision. I slammed the diagnostic printouts onto his desk, showing him the memory leaks, the bypass security protocols, and the horrific open-source integration. Wyatt looked at the papers, and his shoulders slumped. He looked 10 years older than he had the previous month. "Lexi," Wyatt said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know. I see the logs. I know exactly what he is doing." "Then stop him," I demanded, leaning over his desk. "Wyatt, if this system goes live, it will collapse. We are talking about critical infrastructure. We cannot let him put this in front of clients." Wyatt rubbed his temples and let out a long, defeated sigh. "I cannot stop him. Lexi, Richard has tied my hands completely. You have to understand the business side of this. Next week is the live demonstration with the United States Department of Energy. They are flying in from Washington. We are looking at a potential contract worth $200 million. If we secure that contract, we secure our Series C funding. Richard believes Julian's flashy interface is going to close the deal. I need you to just bite your tongue, swallow your pride, and help us survive the next 7 days. Once the ink is dry on that $200 million contract, we will quietly roll back Julian's changes and patch the system. Just endure it until the demo." I stared at him, realizing that the man I had respected for years was nothing more than a coward in a suit. He was willing to risk a catastrophic blackout just to secure venture capital. I left his office feeling completely hollow. The final, breaking blow came the very next morning. I arrived at my desk early, determined to secretly write a patch that would at least insulate the most critical fail-safes from Julian's chaotic code. I opened my terminal and typed in my standard root command. The screen blinked. A cold Ms. Stark message appeared. "Access denied." I tried again. "Access denied. Current permission level. Read only." My heart stopped. I ran a quick background query and saw the undeniable truth. At 2 a.m, Julian had used his father's executive override privileges to completely strip away my administrative access. He had locked the lead system architect out of her own architecture. He downgraded my account so I could only watch the system, ensuring I could not interfere with his so-called masterpiece before the big demonstration. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. I looked at the red errors scrolling endlessly across my read-only monitor. For 5 years, I had fought tooth and nail to protect Vanguard Energy Tech. I had sacrificed my sleep, my personal life, and my peace of mind to build an unbreakable system for a company that had just locked me out of my own house and handed the keys to a toddler with a blowtorch. And in that quiet, isolated moment, the anger that had been suffocating me suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a strange, icy calm. A profound clarity washed over me. The company was already dead. Richard and Wyatt had killed it with their cowardice and greed, and Julian was just the final nail in the coffin. There was absolutely nothing left to save. So, I stopped resisting when Julian strutted past my cubicle an hour later, aggressively chewing gum and asking if I was finally ready to get on board with his vision. I did not argue. I did not warn him about the memory leaks. I did not mention the critical failures. I just looked up at him, gave him a wide, bright smile, and told him that his new charts looked absolutely incredible. I told him his vision was exactly what the industry needed. The smug, self-satisfied grin that spread across his face was almost comical. He nodded, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just stopped trying to prevent his downfall. He thought he had broken my spirit. He had no idea that he had just handed me the exact motivation I needed to orchestrate his absolute destruction. I no longer cared about the red warning lights flashing across my read-only monitor. I stopped sending diagnostic reports. I stopped trying to patch the gaping security holes our chief innovation officer was tearing into the infrastructure. If the ship was destined to sink under the weight of sheer incompetence, I was not going to waste my energy bailing water. Instead, I started building my own lifeboat. My focus shifted entirely away from the active development servers and moved toward the dusty digital archives of Vanguard Energy Tech's legal database. I needed to review the original employment and intellectual property agreements I had signed 5 years ago. Back when we were just a hungry startup operating out of a cramped garage workspace, there was a specific clause I remembered negotiating. A safety net I had insisted upon when Richard Sterling first approached me to be his lead system architect. You see, the absolute heart of the system, the specific module that analyzed dynamic power loads and predicted grid stress before a blackout could occur, was not actually Vanguard property. I had written that predictive algorithm from scratch during my graduate studies. 2 full years before Vanguard Energy Tech even existed as a legal entity, I held the personal, registered patent for that exact mathematical model. When I joined the company, Richard desperately needed my algorithm to make his business pitch viable to early investors. We struck a very specific, legally binding arrangement. The contract stated that Vanguard Energy Tech was granted a perpetual, exclusive license to utilize my proprietary algorithm as the core foundation of their software. However, because I knew the volatile nature of startup environments, I had my lawyer insert an irrevocable revocation clause. The stipulation was crystal clear, buried deep within Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the original licensing agreement. It stated that if the company ever willfully deleted, fundamentally altered, or attempted to replace the original source code of my core algorithm without my explicit, notarized countersignature, the company would immediately be found in material breach of the agreement. In that exact scenario, the exclusive licensing rights would be instantly terminated, and 100% of the intellectual property ownership regarding the entire integrated module would automatically revert back to me. Julian was currently running around the office bragging about how he was going to delete the bloated legacy code and streamline the system with his purchased plugins. He was practically sprinting toward a massive breach of contract, and neither he nor his father had bothered to read the foundational legal documents of their own company. They assumed they owned everything I had ever touched. They were wrong. To spring the trap, I needed to secure the asset. Even though Julian had downgraded my daily user account to read-only status, he lacked the deep, architectural knowledge of the systems I had built. He did not know about the compliance auditing access point. By federal regulation, Any software managing municipal power requires a dedicated, hidden backdoor designed specifically for external state auditors to pull uncorrupted system snapshots in the event of a catastrophic failure. It operated on a completely separate, hard-coded authentication layer that bypassed standard executive permissions. Late on a Thursday evening, long after the rest of the office had gone out for mandatory team-building drinks, I accessed the audit portal. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with practiced precision. I bypassed the main server clusters. Slipping silently into the foundational root directory, I initiated a full, deep extraction protocol. Line by line, gigabyte by gigabyte, I pulled a pristine, uncorrupted copy of the entire system structure. This was the clean build. It was the flawless version of the software before Julian had polluted it with his cheap interfaces and untested artificial intelligence models. It was 5 years of my life, perfectly preserved in digital amber. I routed this massive data package through an encrypted tunnel, transferring it securely to an independent, high-security cloud server registered solely under my legal name and paid for with my personal credit card. I now held the only functional, uncorrupted copy of a system worth hundreds of millions of dollars. With the asset safely secured offline, I turned my attention to the trigger mechanism. I needed undeniable, automated proof of Julian's sabotage the moment it happened. I could not rely on server logs that his father might try to alter or erase later to cover up the disaster. I opened a hidden command terminal and began writing a deeply embedded, autonomous tracking script. In the engineering world, we call this a dead man's switch. It is a silent piece of code that sits entirely dormant, constantly watching for one specific event. I programmed the switch to monitor the exact directory housing my patented core algorithm. I set the parameters with absolute ruthlessness. The moment an unauthorized user, specifically anyone lacking my secure cryptographic signature, initiated a hard delete command on that specific directory, the switch would trigger instantly. It was designed to react in a fraction of a second. Upon activation, the script would immediately take a high-resolution snapshot of the system state, capturing the exact user credentials executing the deletion, the timestamp down to the millisecond, and the exact string of unauthorized code being injected to replace it. But capturing the data was only the first step. The true power of the dead man's switch was its delivery system. I programmed the payload to automatically package this irrefutable forensic evidence into a secure, encrypted file. Upon compiling the file, the script was hard-coded to instantly email the entire package directly to 3 separate destinations. The first destination was the personal inbox of the head of Vanguard's legal department. The second was the chief compliance officer. The third, and most devastating, was the direct reporting address for the United States Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There would be no internal cover-up. There would be no private meetings where Richard could sweep his son's monumental failure under the rug. The moment Julian pulled the trigger, he would be instantly broadcasting his own legal and professional suicide to the federal government. I finished compiling the script, ran a silent diagnostic check to ensure it was completely invisible to routine network scans, and embedded it directly into the master boot record. The trap was set, loaded, and perfectly hidden. For the first time in weeks, my chest felt light. I logged out of the audit terminal and locked my screen. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up in the empty, dimly lit office. I walked over to my desk and pulled a small cardboard box from the bottom drawer, moving with quiet, deliberate calmness. I began to pack. I took down my framed engineering degrees. I packed up my customized ergonomic keyboard and my specialized trackball mouse. I threw away the company-branded coffee mugs and the useless motivational stress balls human resources had handed out. I cleared the surface until nothing remained but a blank, sterile workstation. I did not need to leave a resignation letter. Julian was going to write it for me. Live on stage, in front of the most important clients in the company's history. I slipped on my jacket, picked up my box, and walked out of the glass doors into the cool Texas night, completely ready for the day of judgment. 3 days remained until the historic demonstration. The air inside the office felt dangerously thin, charged with the kind of static electricity that precedes a massive, destructive storm. The timeline was shrinking rapidly, and the pace of Julian's reckless decisions accelerated to a terrifying blur. On Wednesday morning, Julian made a technical decision so fundamentally reckless it defied all rational logic. He issued a direct command to completely sever the connection to our redundant failover servers. In the world of municipal grid management, a failover server is the ultimate, non-negotiable safety net. If the primary system experiences a catastrophic crash due to a power surge or a hardware failure, the failover environment instantly catches the load within a millisecond, preventing a citywide blackout. If a regional hospital was in the middle of a delicate surgery, that redundant server was the only thing guaranteeing the lights stayed on. Julian decided this critical redundancy was, in his own words, an unnecessary and expensive drain on our bandwidth. He aggressively complained to the engineering team that the constant background synchronization process was causing a minor, almost imperceptible lag in the glossy, rotating, three-dimensional animations he had forced onto the main dashboard. To make his user interface spin a fraction of a second faster, he ordered the complete removal of the only safety net protecting our entire infrastructure. He willingly stripped the car of its brakes just to make the rims look slightly shinier for the investors. The engineering floor noticed the change immediately. They were not fools. The few remaining core developers who had stuck around out of sheer loyalty to me finally realized the blast radius of this impending disaster was going to consume absolutely everyone in the room. By Thursday morning, an unprecedented wave of sudden illnesses swept through the department. 2 senior back-end developers abruptly resigned via a brief email, citing immediate personal emergencies. 4 other critical infrastructure engineers called out sick with vague, highly contagious-sounding fevers. Absolutely no one with an ounce of technical literacy wanted their digital fingerprints anywhere near the keyboard when Julian's monstrous creation finally went live. Within 24 hours, the development floor became a silent ghost town. Julian, completely oblivious to the fact that his crew was rapidly abandoning a sinking ship, interpreted the mass exodus as a profound, personal victory. He spent the entire afternoon pacing around the empty cubicles, taking selfies with his expensive phone. My pocket buzzed with a notification from a popular professional networking site. Julian had just posted a long, rambling, self-congratulatory manifesto. He attached a highly filtered photo of himself leaning arrogantly against the glass wall of the main server room. The caption boasted heavily about trimming the corporate fat, and proudly declared he was actively purging the legacy conservatives who lacked the bold vision to disrupt the energy sector. He was publicly documenting his own incompetence for the entire industry to see, and I did not have to lift a single finger to encourage him. The real alarm bells rang at precisely 4:45 in the afternoon. My hidden monitoring script, running silently in the background of the system, pinged my secure terminal. I opened the encrypted log file and stared at the raw data scrolling across the screen. Julian was actively modifying the live production environment. He was bypassing the secure staging servers entirely, injecting his unvetted code straight into the actual interface that the United States Department of Energy would be looking at the very next day. He was installing a massive, highly visible user interface button right in the center of the primary command dashboard. He named it Hard Reset and Sync. I quickly traced the execution path of the new button. It was not a simple visual refresh command. It was a digital executioner's switch. Julian had programmed it to forcefully bypass all standard deployment protocols and security firewalls. When pressed, the button would command the system to immediately wipe the existing foundational architecture, which meant my secure, patented core code, and forcefully overwrite it with his buggy, unvetted upgrade patch. He clearly intended to do this live, right on stage, to dramatically demonstrate how incredibly fast his new architecture could deploy across a simulated city network. He was going to pull the trigger on my legal dead man's switch himself, in front of a live, captive audience of government officials. But before he did, I needed absolute, undeniable proof that he had deliberately bypassed safety protocols to build that specific button. I calmly navigated to the hidden administrative logs. I took a high-resolution, time-stamped screenshot showing Julian's account using executive override privileges to grant himself the highest level of system permissions. The image proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had bypassed every single mandatory code review and skipped the standard security approval process to push this fatal button into the live environment. I saved the image, encrypted the file, and forwarded it directly to my secure, independent cloud server. The trap was now completely sealed and locked. There was absolutely nothing left to do but wait for the curtain to rise. I locked my workstation for the final time and walked out of the corporate building. The heavy Texas heat hit me instantly, but internally, I felt freezing cold, completely detached, and hyper-focused. I walked 2 blocks down the busy street to a high-end cafe and ordered a large, extra-sweet caramel frappuccino. I sipped it slowly, deeply enjoying the sugar rush, and walked directly to my favorite designer boutique. I spent exactly 45 minutes carefully browsing the racks until I found exactly what I needed. I purchased a sharp, tailored, midnight blue power suit. It was not just clothing. It was the kind of pristine armor you wear when you are about to walk into a corporate boardroom and completely dismantle an empire with a smile. I paid for it, took it home, and hung it carefully on the back of my bedroom door. I slept remarkably well that night, fully prepared for the absolute circus that awaited me tomorrow morning. Friday morning arrived with the heavy, expectant atmosphere of a high-stakes theatrical premiere. Vanguard Energy Tech had rented out the most exclusive state-of-the-art glass auditorium in downtown Austin. The room was designed to impress, featuring panoramic views of the city skyline and a massive, curved, light-emitting diode screen that completely dominated the front stage. By 9 in the morning, the space was absolutely packed. The front rows were reserved for the true heavyweights. I saw the stern, serious faces of the senior officials from the United States Department of Energy, flanked by a dozen high-powered venture capitalists wearing bespoke suits that cost more than my first car. These were people who controlled billions of dollars in federal grants and private funding. They did not care about flashy presentations or startup jargon. They cared about reliability, security, and guaranteed return on investment. I sat quietly in the very last row, far away from the flashing cameras and the forced corporate networking. I was wearing my new midnight blue power suit, feeling completely insulated from the impending disaster. I held a fresh, steaming cup of dark roast coffee, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. From my vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire stage and the audience. I was sitting in the private booth of a coliseum, waiting patiently for the gladiators to blindly walk straight into a pit of hungry lions. Promptly at 9:15, the room lights dimmed to a soft glow. A hush fell over the crowd as Chief Executive Officer Richard Sterling strode confidently onto the stage. He looked like a man who had already spent the $200 million contract money in his head. He gripped the edges of the sleek acrylic podium, flashing a brilliant, heavily practiced smile directly at the federal officials. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice echoing with polished charisma. "For years, the energy sector has been tied down by stagnant, conservative thinking. We have relied on heavy, outdated architectures that simply cannot handle the dynamic demands of a modern metropolis. Today, Vanguard Energy Tech is not just offering a software update. We are offering a complete paradigm shift. We are offering a new era of energy distribution, spearheaded by a brilliant, visionary mind. It is my absolute honor to introduce our Chief Innovation Officer and the genius architect of the new Aura Grid experience, Julian Sterling." Polite, scattered applause rippled through the auditorium as Richard stepped back into the shadows. Julian walked onto the stage. He had doubled down on his Silicon Valley guru persona for the big day. He was wearing a black turtleneck, tight designer jeans, and crisp white sneakers. He walked with an exaggerated, slow, purposeful stride, clearly mimicking historic product launches from famous tech billionaires. He did not stand behind the podium. Instead, He grabbed a wireless microphone and paced across the open stage, making intense eye contact with the lead investors. "The grid," Julian said, pausing for dramatic effect. "The grid is alive, but for too long. We have treated it like a dead, mechanical beast. We have built walls around it. We have weighed it down with millions of lines of redundant legacy code." He waved his hand dramatically toward the massive screen behind him. The display flared to life, showing a highly stylized, pulsing three-dimensional map of a massive metropolitan area. "What you are looking at right now is a live, full-scale simulation of a city containing exactly 5 million citizens." Julian continued, his voice brimming with unearned confidence. "This simulation mirrors a peak summer usage scenario. Hospitals are running at maximum capacity. Industrial sectors are drawing massive electrical loads. The subway system is operating at rush hour frequency. Our competitors would need an entire room of engineers frantically managing subsystems just to keep this city running. But Vanguard does it differently. We do it with artificial intelligence, and we do it with seamless, disruptive speed." He pulled a sleek tablet from his back pocket and held it up for the audience to see. A live feed of his tablet screen appeared on the main display. Right next to the glowing city simulation, right in the center of his tablet screen, was the massive, newly installed button I had tracked the day before. The button read, "Hard Reset and Sync." "To truly demonstrate the unparalleled speed and agility of our new integrated artificial intelligence," Julian announced, his voice rising in volume, "I am not just going to run a standard update. I am going to completely erase the old, bloated foundational code of this simulation right here. Live on stage. I will clear out the outdated legacy garbage, and the new aura grid will instantaneously deploy, catch the massive power load, and optimize the entire grid before a single light bulb even flickers. Watch closely." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The temperature in the room seemed to physically drop. The federal officials leaned forward in their chairs, their brows furrowed in sudden, sharp concern. In the world of critical infrastructure, you never, ever delete foundational code on a live system to prove a point. It was a terrifying statement to make in front of the Department of Energy. Julian raised his index finger. He looked out at the audience, flashed a smug, victorious grin, and pressed the button. For exactly 2 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The three-dimensional city continued to pulse with a calm, neon blue glow. Julian opened his mouth to speak, likely to boast about the seamless transition he thought was happening. He never got the chance. The massive digital display behind him suddenly and violently stuttered. A horrible, high-pitched screech of audio feedback blasted through the auditorium speakers, causing several investors in the front row to physically flinch and cover their ears. The beautiful, pulsing blue simulation of the city instantly froze. The intricate web of simulated power lines suddenly shifted from a calm blue to a harsh, blinding, critical red. Then, the entire screen turned pitch black. A deafening, synthesized warning siren began to blare directly from the sound system, the universal sound of a catastrophic system failure. The emergency alarms echoed relentlessly off the glass walls. In the center of the massive, black screen, a single string of pure white, unformatted text appeared. The words were massive, harsh, and utterly unforgiving. "Fatal error. Core algorithm missing. Grid collapsed." Directly beneath the brutal error message, a secondary window popped up, rapidly displaying the simulation parameters. The power flow to the simulated hospitals dropped entirely to 0. The simulated water treatment plants failed instantly. The subway systems halted mid-track. The system was confirming loudly and publicly that a city of 5 million people had just been plunged into a total, apocalyptic blackout. The silence that fell over the auditorium was absolute, heavier than wet concrete. The blaring alarm cut off abruptly, leaving nothing but the sound of the air conditioning humming overhead. No one moved. No one breathed. The investors sat completely paralyzed, their eyes wide with disbelief, staring directly at the brutal error message. The officials from the Department of Energy looked at each other, their expressions instantly hardening from professional curiosity into sheer, unadulterated outrage. On stage, Julian stood completely frozen, staring down at his tablet. The smug grin had melted entirely off his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He frantically tapped the screen of his tablet. He tapped it again, faster, harder. He started aggressively swiping his finger across the glass, desperately trying to force the system to reload. But the screen remained dead. "Hold on," Julian stammered into the microphone, his voice cracking violently. "Just a minor synchronization delay. Give me a second." He dropped the tablet, ran over to the podium, and threw open his backup laptop. He began smashing the keyboard with his trembling fingers. Sweat immediately broke out on his forehead, reflecting the harsh glare of the stage lights. But I knew exactly what was happening behind that black screen. The dead man's switch had already fired. The server had locked him out, encrypted the logs, and completely isolated the environment. He was typing into a digital brick wall. Panic exploded in the front row. Chief Executive Officer Richard Sterling leaped out of his premium leather chair. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He shouted across the room to Wyatt, our Chief Technology Officer, who was sitting near the audio-visual control booth. Wyatt was already furiously typing on his own master terminal, his face entirely pale, shaking his head in absolute, unmitigated horror. The illusion was utterly shattered. The venture capitalists did not wait for an explanation. Several of them immediately pulled out their expensive cell phones, aggressively dialing their risk management teams to halt any pending transfers of capital. The officials from the Department of Energy stood up in unison, grabbing their briefcases, their faces masks of pure disgust. The genius visionary on stage was now just a terrified child smashing a broken keyboard, and the revolutionary technology was entirely dead on arrival. I sat back in the shadows of the final row, crossed my legs, and quietly watched the Vanguard Empire burn exactly as I had designed. Richard was practically foaming at the mouth. He grabbed a microphone from the podium and screamed directly at the audiovisual booth. "Wyatt, roll it back. Engage the failover servers immediately. Do it right now before they leave." Wyatt's voice trembled terribly through the overhead auditorium speakers. "Richard, I cannot. We have no redundant environment." Julian ordered the failover servers completely disconnected on Wednesday to increase the user interface animation speed. We have absolutely zero backups left on the local network. The main house lights suddenly flared on, completely banishing the cinematic darkness and exposing the absolute raw carnage in the room. I stood up from my seat, in the very last row. I smoothed the lapels of my midnight blue jacket and began to walk slowly down the center aisle. Every single head in the auditorium turned toward me. The rhythmic, sharp click of my heels against the hardwood floor was the only sound cutting through the heavy, suffocated silence of the paralyzed room. Julian spotted me. His eyes were wide and frantic, resembling a trapped, terrified animal. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger directly at my face. "It was her! She set me up! She wrote a virus! Arrest her right now!" I did not even break my stride. I walked right past him, treating him with the exact same level of attention one gives to a piece of chewing gum stuck to the bottom of a shoe. I walked directly over to the secondary projection terminal, pulled a small decryption key from my pocket, and bypassed the disabled main computer. I mirrored my independent cloud server directly onto the massive secondary display for everyone to see. The system did not crash due to a technical glitch or a virus, I announced. My voice was amplified, completely level, and terrifyingly calm. The simulation crashed because your chief innovation officer just manually executed a hard deletion of the core source code without any legal authorization. I hit a single key. The screen displayed the automated email generated by my dead man's switch. It showed the exact millisecond Julian had pressed his fatal button, his personal executive login credentials, and the devastating command string he had injected. Next to it, I pulled up a scanned, notarized copy of my original employment contract, highlighting Section 4, Paragraph 12 in bright yellow. As you can plainly see, I continued, projecting my voice across the frozen room. My original algorithm was exclusively licensed to this company. However, the contract strictly mandates that any unauthorized alteration or deletion of that core code immediately triggers a material breach of agreement. I paused, letting the crushing weight of my next words settle over the billionaires and the politicians. And because of that specific act of sabotage you all just witnessed live on stage, the intellectual property revocation clause has been fully activated. Vanguard Energy Tech no longer owns AuraGrid. That core technology, from this exact second forward, belongs entirely to me, Ugh. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The delegates from the Department of Energy did not say a single word. They simply stood up, buttoned their suit jackets, and marched out of the double doors, taking the $200 million government contract straight out of the building. The venture capitalists immediately swarmed the front of the stage, shouting furiously, threatening Richard with massive lawsuits for blatant corporate fraud and gross misrepresentation of digital assets. Richard looked like he was about to have a massive heart attack. He stumbled down the steps of the stage, pushing past the angry investors, and stood right in front of me. He was practically hyperventilating. "Lexi," he begged, his voice cracking, completely stripped of his former arrogance. "Lexi, please, you have to restore the grid. If you walk out of here with the intellectual property, this company goes completely bankrupt by tomorrow morning. I will face federal prison time for defrauding these investors. Please, just name your price." This was the moment. The exact, perfect peak of the mountain I had been climbing for 5 grueling years. I reached into the interior pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small, highly encrypted silver flash drive. I held it up between my fingers. This drive contains the only flawless, uncorrupted master build of the AuraGrid system in existence, I stated coldly. I reached back into my pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. And this is a new, non-negotiable licensing agreement. I will grant Vanguard a temporary, highly restricted license to use my system to salvage this public disaster. The cost is a $15 million upfront cash payment, transferred into my private accounts by the close of business today, plus a guaranteed 10% equity stake in the entire company. Richard swallowed hard, his terrified eyes darting between the silver drive and the paper. "Lexi, $15 million is all the operational capital we have left." "I am fully aware," I replied without blinking. "But there is one final condition. Julian Sterling is to be terminated from this company immediately. He will be completely stripped of all severance packages, all stock options, and all executive benefits. Furthermore, he will sign a binding, permanent non-compete clause that legally bans him from ever stepping foot into an administrative or developmental position in the technology sector for the rest of his natural life." Julian let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp from the stage, clutching his chest as if he had been physically shot. He looked down at his father, his eyes pleading desperately for salvation. Richard looked at his son, then looked back at the furious mob of billionaires ready to tear him apart financially and legally. He did not hesitate for another second. He snatched the heavy metal pen from my hand and aggressively signed his name at the bottom of the document. He traded his own son's entire future for a single silver flash drive. Julian collapsed onto his knees on the stage, burying his face in his hands, completely and utterly ruined in front of the most powerful elite in the entire industry. Yes. I calmly folded the signed contract, placed it securely into my pocket, and handed Richard the drive. I did not say another word to either of them. I turned around and walked up the center aisle, listening to the chaotic, frantic sounds of an empire desperately trying to piece itself back together. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright, warm morning sunlight. I walked into the world not just as a highly skilled engineer, but as a completely self-made multimillionaire, leaving the ashes of the Sterling family legacy far behind me. So, if you are currently sitting in a cramped cubicle, quietly fixing the catastrophic mistakes of an arrogant manager who thinks corporate buzzwords are a substitute for actual competence, remember my story. Document absolutely everything. Read the fine print of your contracts. Build your safety net entirely in the shadows. And when the time is perfectly right, just hand them the match and let them burn their own kingdom to the ground. Thank you all so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city and country down in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's journey of absolute corporate justice, please consider helping our amazing channel. YouTube has completely demonetized us, but you can help keep this platform alive and thriving with a donation of just $1. You can simply scan the donation QR code right here on your screen, or you can click the secure donation link in the video description and in the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helps them feed their families, and guarantees we can keep bringing you the absolute best revenge stories on the internet. Have a wonderful day, and always stay brilliant.